If one of the things we've demonstrated is that the scriptures are equipped to handle extreme type cases, things that are very difficult and complicated and complex, like eating disorders, well, we also know that they're applicable to sort of the run-of-the-mill problems that we all experience. And marital conflict is the bread and butter of church-based counseling. It is what you're going to see the most of, because when you put two sinners under the same roof, you're going to have conflict. So it's a very common experience in that way. But marriage counseling is complicated, and it's complicated by a couple of factors. Krista, will you hand out those sheets for marriage counseling there? It's complicated by a couple of factors. One, it's complicated by the fact that you're dealing with two sinners as opposed to one. And each sinner has their own contributing personality, sinful patterns, insecurities, stories, and backgrounds. And so you're dealing with a whole host of issues versus just one person. It's also complicated by the fact that each of the individuals views the problem from a different, sometimes vastly different perspective. So one person views the problem this way, and the other says it's not that way, it's this way. And so you've got to navigate that conversation. And then it is further complicated by the fact that you don't live in their home, and therefore you will find it difficult to get the facts to really understand the situation. But by understanding some basic principles about marital conflict, we can learn how to help counselees navigate ongoing patterns of failure within their marriage. And then we'll do this, and then we'll have a brief discussion with a case study. So to begin, let's talk about why we have conflict. And to start with, conflict is caused by desire. This is what Scripture plainly teaches us. So if you look at James 4, verses 1 through 3, James says there, "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? You want and you do not have, so you murder." So it's our desires that cause us to fight with one another, even within marriage. I want one thing, you want something else, and so now we are in conflict. You become my enemy because you impede my joy. Now, think about why this might be helpful for us to know. If we're focused on desires, we're not then just offering a couple of strategies or communication skills. A couple will need those things, but we want to get to the heart before we just offer communication skills. Because if I merely offer you communication tactics, but your heart is the same, you will just get better at using the rules to get what you want. But you'll be the same person, right? So this is helpful to focus on desires because it illustrates that the subject of the argument might not actually be the argument or the issue. So whatever we're arguing about might not be the problem. It's more in my motives. So thinking about not just the surface level disagreement or point of tension, but the things going on inside the heart that are driving that. Secondly, this truth is helpful for us because it does make us check our own motives and desires. If conflict arises from passions at war within me, then I need to think about that. So, I might snap at my kids because they're being disobedient, but is it really their disobedience that's frustrating me, or is it that I was expecting peace and quiet when I got home and didn't get it? Now I have to evaluate my own motives. And then it means I also have to pay attention to my spouse's motives and desires. It's too simplistic to just look at the surface level argument. I want to know, what's going on in them, and what are the things that they care about, and what are the things that are driving them, and that allows me then to seek to address the problem more helpfully. I can go back to David Pallison's X-ray questions, which we've mentioned a lot in this teaching and training, but that form, X-ray questions, and you can just Google it, David Pallison X-ray questions, and you'll get the actual form. And it is helpful. It's, whatever it is, 73 questions that get at what do you fear, what do you love, what do you treasure, whose opinion matters to you. And you can go through that and start to understand things about motives. So conflict is caused by desire. Resolution, go ahead. David Pallison, Powlison. Powlison. David Pallison was the director of the Christian Counseling Education Foundation. He passed away 2-3 years ago of cancer, but he's been I think he had 40-some years in biblical counseling, so he's one of the founding fathers, so to speak. Oh, no, that's all right. You can go ahead. So conflict is caused by desire. Resolution starts with me. So our framework for understanding marital conflict must include this particular point, that resolution is always going to start by me evaluating myself. And that's the principle Jesus teaches us in Matthew 7:5, right? That we have a log sticking out of our face, and we're focused on getting the sawdust out of someone else's eye. And he says, you start with yourself. The point, again, is not that your spouse has no problems. It's not that they aren't contributing to the dynamic in your home. They surely are. And you may even feel like they're more responsible than you are. But the Bible says you start with self-evaluation. And Jesus' point here is that our failures should be the most significant to us because they're ours. What's in my eye is most important because it's my eye. I can't see well enough to help you if I don't take the log out of my own eye. I had a pastor friend of mine who says we should think about our sin first, we should think about our sin most, and we should think our sin is worse. Those three categories will always get us the best starting place for helping other people or bringing and approaching others with their issues. And this is important to emphasize in marriage counseling because there is nothing that you as a counselor or you as a spouse can do to change the other person. So a husband and wife come to counseling because of ongoing problems, and they want you to fix their spouse. If he would just think like me, desire like me, do like me, we would get along. And he wants you to fix her. Tell her she's wrong and I'm right, and she just needs to do things my way. And if they come in with the mentality that the other person must change, they won't make any progress. But if they come in ready to say, what do I need to do to be a better spouse? What do I need to do to be a better Christian? Then there's things they can actually address. And what tends to happen in marriage counseling is most everyone wants to match the output of their spouse. So if my spouse puts in 50% effort, then I'll put in 50%. But if they only put in 20% of the effort, then I'm only putting in 20%. And so resolution is often stalled because we're constantly focused on the other person. If you keep a running tally of how much you've done and how much your spouse has done, then your relationship will start to look more like manipulation than actual love and respect. So this means that in the process of change, we're going to have to look at our own motivations first. And we're going to have to think, what are the things in my heart that are coloring my responses, driving my attitude? So with self-evaluation, I always like to send people to Paul's vice and virtue lists. You see these throughout the apostles. So Ephesians 4:25 through 32. I'll have people read that section and then come back and say to me, what are the areas that you're strongest in from this list? And what are the areas that you're weakest in? Or I might have them look at Colossians 3:1 through 17. Ask the same question. When Paul describes these things here, what do you do well? What do you do poorly? Or I might have them look at Galatians 5:22 through 23. What are the fruit of the spirits? Which of those fruits do you feel strong in, like you have a lot of, and which do you feel like you need to cultivate more? So helping them to identify areas of weakness in their responses, their attitudes, their actions towards their spouse. So conflict starts with desire, resolution starts with me, and resolution moves toward understanding. So our framework is going to identify the need to move towards your spouse in conflict. And conflict always gives us two choices. I can move away from you or I can move towards you. Counselor Winston Smith does a really wonderful job in his book, Marriage Matters, of demonstrating how conflict is an opportunity. And I love that language. He says it this way: we must realize that the hurts and frustrations in marriage that are common to the point of seeming ordinary are in fact opportunities to know and share God's extraordinary love. So he talks about how moments of conflict and frustration are used by God to help us see ourselves more clearly and help us see Him more clearly. And when we view conflict as an opportunity, it doesn't make it less frustrating, but it gives me a new point of reference for how I'm going to engage. Moving towards your spouse means seeking to understand them. You do not have to agree with your spouse, but seeking to understand them allows you to move closer to resolution of a conflict. In order to do this, we have to listen non-defensively, So I need to be open to your criticism and willing to find out what is the main point of frustration that you have with me. I don't have to agree with that. I just have to not be defensive. I need to be willing to say, okay, there's certainly a possibility that that's true. Let's explore that. Let me understand better. It means asking good questions instead of jumping to conclusions or accusations, seeking to understand. And it means seeking to find common ground. What are areas that maybe we don't see the problem exactly the same, but we both agree this. We both have the same opinion of that. We're on the same page to this point. It's maybe after that things break down. But we could start with identifying common ground. Where are we on the same page and on the same team? Then lastly, resolution seeks to build relational trust. So conflict does impact our relationships. And all relationships, no matter how healthy, have conflict. But as we work to resolve conflict, we can use problems as an occasion to build trust between spouses. So if I go into conflict seeking to understand my spouse, seeking to honor their concerns, not plow over them, manipulate them, control them, attack them, all those sorts of things. If I go in with the goal to understand and honor their concerns, then even if we disagree, they feel like they trust me. The Gottman Institute, which is a marriage therapy organization, has identified a number of common conflict tactics that, when consistently used over the long haul in a marriage, present massive problems, often leading couples to divorce. In fact, John Gottman says he can watch a couple fight and he can tell you how long he thinks they'll make it in marriage. He calls them the 4 horsemen of the marital apocalypse. And these are the tactics that almost always destroy marriages. The first one, he says, is criticism. So the difference between offering a critique and criticizing is that criticism is personal. I'm attacking you. I'm not just offering critique and saying this isn't working, this isn't right, but I'm attacking you as a person. Criticism, contempt. So as criticism builds, couples tend towards contempt. Now our interactions look more like mocking and derision and meanness. We're not just at odds, we're actually harmful in the ways we speak to one another. We're mocking one another. As that builds, it tends to create defensiveness, which is a persistent unwillingness to hear critical feedback. And then lastly, he says stonewalling, which is shutting down or withdrawing from the other person, both in communication and in relationship. Criticism, contempt, defensiveness, stonewalling. And where those things abound in a relationship will deteriorate. I often talk to couples about, imagine that the relational trust, the capital that you have as a couple in the relationship, that trust is a jar of marbles. And every time you have negative interactions, you are scooping handfuls of marbles out of that jar. Every time you have good, healthy interactions, you're dropping 1 or 2 in there. If you consistently have negative upon negative upon negative interactions, you are scooping handfuls of marbles out of that jar to the point that it depletes, and you can't drop enough in to offset the difference. And what happens when that jar becomes empty is that there is no trust in the relationship anymore. And that means that everything that is done in the marriage then becomes viewed with suspicion and accusation. And so even if he's being nice to me, I think, well, what does he want, right? And so there's no trust in the relationship anymore. So we have to find ways to fill up that marble jar again. Let's talk about some strategies for navigating conflict. Scripture outlines for us a number of key principles. I won't have time to explore all of those, but I want to look at Ephesians chapter 4 with you. Ephesians chapter 4. And I want to read a little bit of a section here, verses 25 through 32. 25 through 32 of Ephesians 4. Here's what Paul writes. Therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Now, Paul is not speaking primarily about marriage here, but the principles that he establishes here for good, healthy communication are relevant for marriage. And so let's consider what he says in the text. He begins with the principle, speak the truth. That's verse 25. So here he rules out the sort of passive-aggressive tactics that we tend to use with one another, right? The sort of, I've talked about it before, the husband who says to his wife, do you mind if I go play golf with the guys today? And she says, yeah, it's fine, whatever, right? Is it fine? Is it really okay with her? No, it's not. But she doesn't want to confront the issue. She wants him to acknowledge it without her having to bring it up, which isn't wrong, but it isn't a good tactic. No passive aggressiveness. We do this all the time, right? Are you upset with me? No, I'm fine, right? But we're trying to communicate our negative emotions to our spouse without engaging in conversation on the issues. Speaking the truth is motivated in this text by our mutual investment with one another. We are members of one another, Paul says. So we've got this mutual investment that says since we're members of one another, we need to speak the truth. He warns in verses 26 through 27 about dealing with issues when they arise. So don't let bitterness develop. If we can't let love cover something, then we need to bring it up. So one of the things that we always want to remember is the stuff we don't address, that we try to bury under the floorboards in our house, it always comes back. It always comes back. Address it when it happens or shortly thereafter. Verses 29 through 32, he says, guard your words and guard your attitude. So he warns us not to use corrupt speech, but to use language that builds others up, which doesn't mean that you can't correct or rebuke, but it means that we do so with the goal of helping others grow, not simply to stick it to them. He warns us that how we treat one another can actually grieve the Holy Spirit of God. The way that you speak to your spouse can cause God grief. That's an intense thought. He highlights in verse 29, next principle here, that we need to pick the right time to speak. So he says that it fits the occasion. And that reminds us that not every moment is a good moment to start a hard conversation, right? So husbands and wives often have, especially parents, often have the bad habit of starting the conversation when they're crawling into bed after a really long day, right? And I don't know about you, but we don't generally have really great conversations when we're both exhausted and getting ready to go to sleep, right? We're usually too tired to do it well, right? So picking the right occasion. I don't remember what the argument was about, but I remember that Krista and I chose a very short car ride to pick a fight about something. And so we had no time to actually discuss the issue before we, knocked on our friends' doors and had to pretend that we were, happy and wonderful and doing well. So fits the occasion means it tries to be sensitive to the dynamics of the conversation, tries to be sensitive to the needs of my spouse and the circumstances of our life. Is now the best time to bring up this issue? What timing will provide us the best possible chance to discuss all these things? So evaluate when you bring things up. Now, these are general principles that outline for us how we're to approach one another, but they give us some specific starting places as we think about the couples that might sit across from us. What do they need? Where do I see the weaknesses in their interaction? What can I help them work on? But let's use the remainder of our time to talk about a case study. So I'm going to mention a couple that I'm calling Cameron and Candace. Cameron and Candace. So in your section on your notes there, you write down the things that stand out to you, that you think will be important to remember, and then think as well about the types of questions that you might have for this couple. All right, Candace and Cameron are a young couple who've been married for 5 years. They have one daughter. She is 2 years old. They've requested to meet with you because they've been having constant conflict. Candace describes the conflict this way: Cameron never listens to me. He doesn't help me with anything around the house or with our daughter, and anytime I bring it up, he becomes defensive and an argument ensues. Sometimes the arguments can get pretty heated and we can say really hurtful things to one another, but most of the time, he just gets annoyed and walks off, leaving me to fume. Then I always have to go to him and try to repair things. He rarely apologizes or takes responsibility. I'm beginning to feel like he just doesn't care about our relationship. Cameron has a different take on the problem, and this is the way he relates the problem to you. Candace is always annoyed about something, and I can't seem to do anything right. She is never happy with me. Every day I come home from my job, and she starts in with some complaint. I've asked her not to do that. I need time to unwind. Usually things get pretty heated, and I have to end the conversation. Most of the time, she recognizes that she was wrong and comes to find me and apologize. But the pattern will just start over again tomorrow. I'd like to be able to have a happy relationship with my wife, but she's just so hard to please. All right, let's start with this information. What are some things first? Just what's some of the impression you have about this couple? What are some things that are going around in your head based on the information? And then we'll talk about some questions you might have to get to know them. What's your impression of this situation and this couple first? Okay. So they're both focused on their own needs. Control issues. Blaming each other. Yeah. They've definitely come in as enemies, right? Occasionally, you can see this right out of the gate. I remember a couple who came in. The wife sat down. The husband took his chair and moved it away from her and then sat down. And I thought, oh, we are starting in a lot of information right out of the gate, right? Yeah. And what else stands out to you about them? Yep. And that's important information for us. It's giving us a picture of kind of what their lives might look like. Let me ask this. Do you feel like there's any validity to either of their complaints? Yeah. You can understand why each of them might feel some of the frustration that they feel, right? We don't have to pick a side, right? Our job is not to referee who's winning the argument and who's losing. Our job is to just try and validate what are some of the frustrations. And so we can, in that moment, say, yeah, those are valid things to be discouraged about, frustrated with, or want to see changed. You don't have to blame the other person. You can simply acknowledge, yeah, I think that would be something I'd want to see changed. Yeah. So we can appreciate some of their complaints. What are some questions you might have for Candace and Cameron? Okay, so what types of things spark arguments? Right? She's at least identified housework and helping with their daughter. He didn't identify specific things, so it would be good to ask him more pointedly, well, what are some of the things that she complains about? If he says housework and their daughter, okay, we've at least got a common ground. If he says 80 other things, well, let's talk about why there's a difference in just identifying what the points of tension are. Yeah, other questions you might have. That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, we talking 0 to 60 in no time flat, or does it take a lot? Do you try anything to try and resolve the conflict? Do you try to keep your calm? It might even be relevant to ask the question, do your arguments, are they the same now as they were, your daughter's 2 years old, were they the same now as they were 2 years ago? That is, do we go from 0 to 60 now, but before, we would try to work on things, and because that tells you something a little bit about how worn down they are as a couple, right? If they've been going through these motions for 2 years, and now they can go to from 0 to 60 in no time flat, that tells you a little bit more about the state of the relationship, where they're at with trust, where they're at with just their own weariness and frustration with one another. Yeah. Other questions, other things that come. Yeah, that's a good question. And we want to understand about their social support. Like, who's involved in your life? Who's helped you think about marriage? Who are people that you could talk to about the dynamics in your relationship? Are you part of a church? What's your family dynamic like, right? How close are mom and dad, and where they fit in these pictures? All that sort of stuff. Yeah, absolutely. We might ask questions about their family of origin. What did conflict look like in your home? How did your mom and dad fight? What did you witness? How did you see that play out? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Like, what makes this such a sensitive topic? Or what makes it so difficult to not just be able to stay calm and engaged? Yeah. Yeah, that sort of self-sabotage, right? That allows me to get out of a conflict I don't want to have in the first place, or a conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's a little predictability for him, right? I hadn't even considered that, John, but that's interesting. There's a little predictability for him, right? She'll always come back, right? And if I escalate things to the point that I can justify walking away, then I don't have to have this conversation, right? And there's a truth here that working through conflict takes a lot more time and a lot more patience. And so for some people, it's just easier to get mad and storm off. Yeah. We don't know that yet, so we don't want to go to that conclusion, but we want to start thinking about, okay, what might be going on in this scenario? What are questions I need to ask to gather more information to put the pieces together? Where might we begin if we're going to try and help this couple? If we're going to try and step into their situation, where might you begin? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he's calling a cycle, right? And she says too, right? I always have to go to him and try to repair things. He never comes to me and tries to repair it. So he's recognizing a cycle here, but he's interpreting it, right? So he's making an interpretation. She finally realizes she's wrong, and she comes back to apologize to me. He has now interpreted all the circumstances. So it would be interesting if we're having that conversation live as a couple, they're both here, and he says that. It would be interesting for me to ask her, is that how you view what's going on? Do you come to that conclusion, I was wrong and I need to, that actually now opens up a conversation about the way he's interpreting her. So then I can ask him, well, what leads you to that interpretation of her? Because she says that's not what she believes. Yeah? Yeah. What I remember about this couple, he would have let things linger days, weeks, and she just couldn't live like that. And so she would just come and she would apologize for getting mad just so they could have a little peace again. Yeah. Yeah, just to try and start over. Yeah. And nothing, of course, ever got solved. She just would say, all right, can we just start over? Can we just forget about that? And he was always happy to forget about it, right? But then they're going to have the same argument over and over and over. And so that was one thing we talked about pretty early on is it sounds like you guys aren't actually able to resolve anything. And so you're having it's a chronic problem. You're having the same argument because you haven't done anything to address the argument. And so that gave us an opportunity to talk about his tactic of walking away and talk about sort of how could we re-engage with the conversation. I started by getting a history of their relationship. I wanted to know more about them as a couple, how they met, how they got started in marriage. I wanted to know when their problems started and how they've changed over the years. They've been married 5 years. Candace seemed to think the issues were present almost from the beginning. Cameron likes his comfort, she says, and doesn't want to be bothered. Early in marriage, she could tolerate that, but now that they have a daughter, she needs him to be more engaged. There's too much to do, she says. Cameron says that these things changed only after their daughter was born because Candace stopped paying attention to him. She used to be really affectionate and fun, and now she doesn't have time for me. They have different explanations for the cause of the problem, right? What is Candace's explanation for the cause? What does she say is the reason that they're having these problems? Yeah, he likes to be comfortable and doesn't want to be bothered, right? And she needs his help. What does Cameron say is the reason they're having conflict? Yeah, the daughter. He blames their daughter, right? That's probably not a good thing to say, but yeah. She stopped paying attention to him. She stopped investing in him. They both recognized that things changed after their daughter was born. So we could at least acknowledge there's some common ground here. This is when things really started to change. Even if the problems were perceived back here and felt back here, Candace was dealing with it differently, and now things have changed. Yeah, absolutely. I wanted them to probe a little deeper in their own motivations. I gave them x-ray questions from Pallison, circled a bunch and had them answer those. And that revealed a couple of things. Namely, I saw that Candace had a lot of fear of man, and that might explain some of the things that were going on, but it didn't seem super relevant to the problem. I did see that Cameron loved comfort. His comfort was one of the most important driving motivations for him. It was not only the reason for the conflicts that they often had, it was also the reason that they couldn't resolve those conflicts. When Candace would offer critiques or ask Cameron to help out more, he would get annoyed and he would want to avoid that conversation. It wasn't comfortable. He didn't like criticism, so he would find a way to avoid that. How might we, if we see all this data coming out, how might we help Cameron see his own sin a little more clearly? Any strategies that you can think of, ways we could help him to get that, visualize that? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Yes. So we have a little form that we call journaling a problem incident. And it just asks questions like, what's the incident? What did I do? What did I want? What did I feel? All sorts of questions just to answer. And I would often say, look, I know you're not going to do this in the moment that you're having an argument. Like, okay, hold on, honey. I've got to get out my sheet from Dave, and I've got to fill this out while we're arguing. But I would say, after the fact, go back and look at yourself. Think about that. And I would say, I want you to bring me a handful of these, right? Bring me 5 of these, and let's go over, and let's look at patterns. And getting him to do that was a little difficult. But eventually, as we kept working on it, he did. He brought in a handful of just a stack of papers that gave me bits of information that we could comb through and say, I'm seeing a pattern. What do you see? And he was able to acknowledge that there were certain attitudes that he had that were wrong and sinful. It took a few sessions, but I decided to meet with Cameron on his own for a little while. I wanted to learn more about his life story, what shaped him and influenced him. So he told me about his childhood, and he said that he had a demanding father whom he could never please. He grew up in a very hyper-legalistic Christian home. So that certainly played a part in my understanding of why he was so resistant to negative interactions from her, right? If he felt like he was being criticized, it served as a trigger for him that just made him feel like, yep, here's another way I'm inadequate, insufficient, always doing the wrong thing. This is in my notes, but I'm thinking here, we all have filters that serve as sort of the primary way that we interpret other people. And if I can learn to identify what my filter is, then I can offer some corrective to not reading people with assumptions and bias. We also explored the impact his defensiveness was having on the relationship. So we talked about when you are defensive, when you are automatically unwilling, you hold up your hand to any critique. How do you think that Candace is interpreting that? How is that impacting your dynamic? So giving him a chance to see and to out loud verbalize, how am I negatively affecting my relationship with my wife? So we just had some time to actually walk through that. And I actually just wrote, if I had a dry erase board, I would write it on the board. But I just wrote on a sheet of paper, you tell me, you describe for me, what's the way I'm impacting? We put that all down on a sheet of paper, and I handed that to him. That was, I think, helpful. That gave him something visual to look at and go, ooh. And that wasn't her telling him. It wasn't even me telling him. It was him admitting, yeah, I see that. That was a big step. That was something that started to produce some fruit for him. I also walked him through James 3:17. James 3:17 is about with James 3 there is about the distinction between heavenly wisdom and earthly wisdom. Earthly wisdom is unspiritual and demonic. But heavenly wisdom, James 3:17 says this, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, then gentle, then open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. He was convinced, she's wrong, I'm right. If I wait it out, she'll come apologize. We looked at, that's not wisdom that is open to reason, impartial. It's not wisdom that is even full of mercy and good fruit. As we began to expose ways in which he was arrogant and prideful and selfish, and I wanted him to learn to be wise, which meant that he had to be peaceable, gentle, and open to reason. He was not presently open to Candace's influence, and therefore he was not wise according to what the Lord called him. Slowly, he did begin to see some of those things, and he did begin to soften. So having identified more clearly the root problem, having worked to get buy-in from the counselee, now we wanted to shift gears to practically what could he do to help with that. If you think about conflict resolution skills, what are some things that you might give to Candace and Cameron to help them resolve a conflict when things come up? What could we do? Suggestions, thoughts, things running around in your head? Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah, and finding, like, even sometimes little things, like, if all your conflicts are happening in your bedroom, then choose to stay in the living room and discuss an issue, right? Or sometimes, we talk about conflict creates energy in our bodies, right? So, you know what? Let's clean the kitchen while we dialogue about this, right? Let's busy ourselves so we're not just sitting there fuming, trying to hold it all in, right? Let's use some of that energy and talk while we work. It could be that we talk to them about what's called emotional flooding, that in moments of stress and tension, our body gets overwhelmed. And at the moments that we flood, we no longer are at places where we can communicate calmly, clearly, and rationally. And so we might need to institute what we call taking a break. So there are rules about this. We have a little sheet that we give people that walks through the rules. You take a break for yourself, not for somebody else. So I don't say to my wife, you look like you need a break, right? No, I say, I need a break. And if I take a break, then when we set a time to come back to the conversation, let's come back to this after the kids go to bed. Let's talk about this, tomorrow after I get home from work, whatever. I need to calm down. If I take the break, then when we come back, she gets to restart the conversation. Because what'll happen is I don't like what you're saying, so suddenly I need to take a break. And then when we come back, I start up the conversation again, and you don't get to finish your thought, right? So it can be a way that we control and manipulate if we take a break wrongly. So there are rules. But we might talk to them about that, taking a break, learning to gauge my own body and my own responses. Yeah. 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 Yeah, absolutely. Being able to, in the moment, say, I hear you saying this. Is that right? And being able then to say, I can see why you feel that way. I don't agree, maybe, but I understand, why you feel that way or why this is such an important issue for you or whatever. Being able to find that common ground. One of the things that's really important in marriage counseling is keeping the conflict in the room. So what I like to do is not talk to me about the conflict you had 3 nights ago. Let's talk about it right now. You two have this fight in front of me right here. Let's talk about it. Why? Because what I like to do is I like to be able in real time to say, okay, time out. Let me talk to you for a second, Cameron, about the comment you just made. It was a pretty sarcastic, biting comment. And I could imagine that might be pretty off-putting or that might take escalate the conflict, right? And asking Candace, how did you feel when you heard him say that, right? So now we have real-time possibility to point out an area where he could change and grow, right? Or to say, okay, I noticed when you brought this up, you came in guns a-blazing. There wasn't a question. It was a straight-out accusation. You were ready to fight, right? So now we have opportunity in the room to have the fight and actually identify the patterns that they're involved in that are creating the conflict or exacerbating it. So what I tell them, yeah, yes. What I tell them is we're not interested in solving the issue. I'm not going to tell you who's right and who's wrong. We're not going to come to a resolution. They are, but what I'm asking them to do here, what I tell them in general, this is what I say. The goal of this is not to resolve the conflict. It's to learn to honor the Lord and honor one another in the conflict. So, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it's an exercise in learning about my bad habits and learning about your good habits. And so trying to keep them in the room means I don't care about resolving the issue. Because most of the time it's the same fight, there's having it again this week, or it's not even really that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things. It's not the 30,000-foot view issue. It's just this little thing that you put the silverware away wrong, and I've asked you not to do that, and okay, all right, whatever. But I don't want them to solve the issue. I just want them to learn, can I honor the Lord and honor my spouse in the way that we talk to one another? So we're just practicing new skills is what we're trying to do. Yeah.
And so the way I look at it is we're changing the reward. The reward before was,
Yeah.
we'll shut our mouths and everything will be okay.
Yeah.
But now we're not doing that. What we're doing is we're rejecting it.
Yeah. And I always tell them I have the authority to say stop, and you have to stop, right? So, I don't want things to get out of hand. I want them to rein it back in. I have the authority to say, okay, I need you to stop. We're going to take a break. I want to comment on this or that or whatever. So they're trying to interact with me. Most of the time, couples don't want to fight in front of you like they do at home, right? They want to look very good to you, right? They want you to believe they are the better spouse and they're more calm and controlled. And so they do try. What happens, of course, is these are sensitive issues often, right? They start to touch on a litany of problems that they have in the marriage, and so you do get a better sense than they think you do of what their fights actually look like. Not perfectly. It's certainly a lot more loud or volatile or whatever at home, but you do get a sense of things. You can hear the biting comments, the sarcasm, the exasperation, the eye rolls. You can see those things, and you can start to comment on those, and that gives us real-time working opportunities. As Candace and Cameron worked on understanding one another, some things certainly have persisted in their relationship, but overall, they saw real growth and real hope. So one of the things that we practiced most on was helping them evaluate their own habits and learning how to identify when they were doing the things that were causing problems and change those. So it wasn't that they didn't have conflict, and it wasn't even that their bad habits didn't come back. They just got better at going, okay. In fact, this one couple I'm working with now, he was talking with me a couple weeks ago, and we've been practicing saying, can I try that again? So he has a bad habit of being, coming in, guns a-blazing, attacking right out of the gate. And so he said, I did that this week. I actually did it twice in the same conversation. Right? I said, can I try that again? I was wrong. And she said, yes. And I tried again, and we got a few more steps into the argument, and I did it again, and I said, I'd like to try that also again. And I thought, that's success, right? And it kind of took the heat out of the conversation because they both kind of laughed, right? And so they were able in that moment to say, okay, there's real effort and real change being made here. And it was similar with Candace and Cameron. All right, we got just a couple minutes left. And what I'm going to do at that time is give you a chance to just ask whatever burning questions you have. I'll ask Krista if she wants to come up and respond to. But thinking about all the things we've covered, thinking about things we haven't covered that are on your mind, thoughts you have about counseling that we might be able to give a few answers to. Yeah, right here.
I have one question for Krista.
My parents did not like necessarily like I was a very driven child, and so I've even asked my mom before, like, how did you get me to do my homework? Like, my kids are driving me crazy. They won't do their work. Like, how did you get me? And she was like, I didn't have to do that. Like, I just was like, I'm gonna get this done. And sports were particularly something that I saw that pattern where I could, see something accomplished, and I could. So I was personally drawn to them, and yeah, you couldn't have kept me away from them. They didn't really have a lot to do with that. Yeah.
So in that case with them, I asked their permission to, like, how can we, do you guys feel okay if I just have a couple sessions to talk with Cameron? Because I'd like to ask him some things that, I framed it in terms of I want to have a little more open dialogue, and sometimes we're reserved to say things when we're in front of our spouse. What I often do is I try to match that. So I did have some individual sessions with Cameron, and then I had a couple of individual sessions with Candace just to keep her in the loop, talk about where she was at, what she was struggling with. She doesn't know what I'm talking individually with Cameron about, so her perception is I'm doing the same thing with him that I'm doing with her, and we're just trying to work on them individually, where they are spiritually, how they're, managing their own emotions in the midst of things. So I did try to keep her kind of engaged that way. And for him, it felt like, okay, he's not just talking to me, he is talking to her. But there was a point at which I did outright say to him, like, there's a degree to which you bear a greater responsibility here, and I want you to be able to embrace that so that you can work on things. I did not say that to her, but I wanted to say that to him because I wanted him to see, he's contributing to this conflict in ways that if he changes, it will change the dynamic. So, and often I'll tell people, there's, to whatever percentage you think you're responsible, I just want you to own that percent 100%. So if you say, I'm only 10%, that's fine. Let's just focus on that 10% fully. Let's not focus on the 90 that's hers. So, but yeah, I do try to offset that. Anything you would add? You've got some marriage counseling.
I don't know.
No, yeah, same thing. Okay. Other questions? Yeah. Yes. No, yes. She was specific about the kinds of things that she needed his help with. I can't remember specifically what they were, but I mean, she had a sort of type A personality. She was specific and clear and concrete, and she even would say, like, he would sometimes accuse her of not telling him what she wanted. And she would say, I wrote it on a list on the fridge. You read it. I know you saw it. We've talked about it. Like, for you to say that you don't know what I want is a game. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. That's great.
I mean, that's a challenge that I have more so than him. He handed me the mic so I could say the like what not to do, but yeah, because I tend to I don't know where to interject, but he's really good about like just stepping in and having something to say to remind them of what the goal is, to keep that everyone focused back on what we're supposed to be doing. And I know sometimes he's told me to just tell them, you know, basically you came here because you wanted my help. Like we can't do that if you're not going to stay on the topic. Or I think that's the only way. And I think the reason for that is just the things you said. Just, I mean, a scheduling thing. You don't want to keep it going like eternally, but I think it's hard to keep everyone's attention past that. Like you're not really gaining a lot of I don't know, you're not gaining a lot of anything after the hour. Everyone just gets tired, and you don't want to talk about the same thing for that long of a time.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, I keep mine to about 50 minutes with a little bit of wiggle room there because at some point I'm just mentally fatigued and I need a couple minutes to refresh or do whatever before I have to go into another session, and so I'll do that. But I know some people that they do it differently. They actually don't do 1 hour once a week. They do 2 hours every other week. And I mean, that's great. I'm glad for them. And that gives them a little bit longer with couples to work through dynamics. So I can see the value of that. But scheduling-wise, for me, that just would be really difficult to do 2 hours. I'll get to you in just a second, Matt. The other, to answer your question the other way, I do think I try to say to people, like, I want to help you deal with the pattern of the problem and not just this one incident. So if we spend all our time focused on the one conflict that you guys had last week, you'll just have another conflict next week. And then you'll have another one the week after and another one the week after. And you'll just keep coming to me to referee each fight. What I want to do is actually help kind of pull you up 30,000 feet and say, here's the reason you keep having these fights. If we can focus on that, that will actually save you in the long run. So I may need to remind them of that again. Like I may later in the conversation say, okay, let's not get bogged down in this one incident. And so that's just a reminder to them of we need to kind of zoom out again and talk about the patterns. But the other part of it is sometimes you do just need to interrupt a talkative counselee, especially in couples, and say, okay, I want to stop you there, and I want to get your wife's thoughts, or I want to get your husband's thoughts on this point. So giving them that. And sometimes you might even need to say, I think one of the reasons you're having so much conflict is you don't listen, you do a lot of talking. And so that may even be part of it. Yeah, probably. Ooh, yeah. You want to comment on that, or you want me to? He said, what safeguards do you put in place when you're counseling someone of the opposite sex? So the way that I've been able to work that in our place is we have windows in all the office doors. I only meet with women during office hours. So I'll counsel in the evenings when the church is generally closed, but I will only counsel couples or men in those hours. The other times it's with the rest of the church staff moving about the office, looking in, all that sort of stuff. But the best way I found to do that is we do a lot of training. So we often have trainees sitting in on sessions. So if I'm counseling a woman, I'll ask one of our female trainees to sit in and observe. And sometimes, if they're far enough in their training, I might even say, hey, I think this would be a good case for you just to take and for you to then meet with this person. At other times, we might do what we call advocacy, where I have the counselee bring somebody with them that I'm going to equip to help them when they're not in sessions with me. So it's all about, we try to have... I jokingly say, we like to have as many people as we can in the room, which isn't true. But I do think it's helpful to have a trainee or an advocate. And one of the things that we're really big on is, we don't want to be a church that has a counseling ministry, but a church that is a counseling ministry. And that means I want to equip as many people as possible to do this. And that means even if it's your best friend who's also a member of the church, bring them. Let's encourage them to learn how to be helpful in this type of situation as well.
Is that like a... No, I mean, I've had to do that for like getting my counseling hours in. I have to, and usually it just takes asking the person ahead of time, like if they're okay with it. So, they'll have to. That's the other thing is with a lot of things that you do, there's forms to sign so that you kind of cover all of that stuff. But yeah.
We've got forms like if you want to record, if you want to ask permission to record a session, you have to get a sign of release from the counselee that says, yes, I give you permission to use this. If you want that, they may want you to share information with somebody else. So I got to get a release of information to do. So we go through all those hoops just to make sure everything's above board and that there's no accusations that we were, sharing information that we weren't given privy to. All right, we are out of time, so I'm going to pray. Thank you guys so much for giving up Thursdays for the last couple months here. Your willingness to come out and to learn and to ask good questions is great. I know Matt's got some ideas about next steps for you all, and we would love to have ongoing conversations about how to encourage that. So, Cornerstone folks, I have my own ideas for next steps for you also. All right, let me pray for us. Lord, thank you for your grace to us. Thank you for your word and your spirit and your church. And thank you for these believers here who want to grow and learn how to love your people well. Help each of us. Help us to use the word for our own lives, and help us to use the word by your Spirit and for your glory in the lives of one another. We pray this in Jesus' name, and amen.